Oh, perfect. Thank you. Classic. Forgetting to record. All right. So yeah, April Zaniski is here with us. She received her doctorate in 2004 from the University of Massachusetts, and she is a nationally renowned expert in the area of large-scale assessment and computer-based testing. Her research has been presented at national and international conferences, and she has published papers in applied measurement in education, the Journal of Educational Measurement, and numerous books and encyclopedias related to measurement and educational research. Currently, she is Research Associate Professor at Director of Computer-Based Testing Initiatives for the Center for Educational Assessment at UMass, where she has worked on comprehensive evaluation of National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, and is now project manager and psychometrician for computer-based testing for adult education programs in Massachusetts. She currently serves as the associate editor of the International Journal of Testing and is an occasional manuscript reviewer for several measurement journals. So thank you for joining us, April. Welcome.
Can I just, you may have an older bio for me. I'm no longer involved with IJT, but I am a co-editor with my colleague Lisa Keller for practical research, practical assessment research and evaluation. So I have a different editor role now. So,
thank you. Yes, perfect.
Sorry.
I was slightly worried. Maybe next time I will give that to you ahead of time so you can edit it. But yeah, thank you for being here with us. I think also what we're going to do next is something we haven't done in the past, is do just quick whip around and do some introductions of ourselves so we know who's in the room and start off that way. So let's start with Sergio. Let's start with you.
All right. Well, hi everybody. My name is Sergio Araneda. I am a third-year PhD student at UMass first, and yeah, very happy to have you, April.
And let's do a prompt for this too. So introduction of who you are, where you're from, and then maybe something you're working on or something you're excited about when we go through. So anyone who wants to jump in here can go next.
I guess no, please go ahead, Ola.
No, I was just saying the ladies should go.
Let's go with Gabe.
Okay, Gabriel, please.
Hey everybody, my name's Gabriel. I'm a many year PhD student at UMass Amherst, and I'm currently working on a simulation study to look at hierarchical cluster analysis and how sensitive it is to detect data structures in small sample sizes.
And Olu?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I was thinking the ladies should go, as they always say. I am Olumiwa Desmenu. I'm a Nigerian. I'm currently studying at the University of Kentucky. I'm studying educational policy and evaluation. And I am working on looking at competencies, especially interdisciplinary competencies. As regard a particular project, the project is called CAREC, and the project is for graduate students. So there's appear to be some disconnect between what the graduate students are expected to bring into the program and what they are currently bringing. So we want to see where that disconnect is. Maybe the disconnect is from the undergraduate training or wherever. So we're looking at those competencies and merging them and see where if we found the gap, then make recommendations about what kind of trainings should be included into the undergraduate programs. Thank you.
Let's just jump to Maggie.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Maggie Biding Parrish. I'm in my 6th year at CUNY Graduate Center. I'm currently using natural language processing techniques to analyze this very large corpus of state mathematics standardized assessments that I collected. And I'm looking for the presence of biased language that negatively impacts English language learner performance, and also using these label cases to develop a machine learning informed lexical parser for test makers and teachers to make their tests more equitable.
Nice. And sorry if I don't pronounce this correctly, but
It's Merve.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Merve Sarach, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at UW-Madison, and I'm working with Dr. James Wallach, and mostly focusing on validity and fairness issues in testing. What I particularly focus on, though, is real-time anomalous response behavior detection. So we're working on statistical methods to capture that in the real-time moment. And something exciting I'm doing currently is to make a flyer on Photoshop for the first time for an upcoming event at NCME. And I was going to say one more thing. I'm from Turkey, so the name is from Turkey.
Awesome, thank you. And Stephanie.
Oh, hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm actually in my first year of a master's program. So what I'm learning, I'm in Boise. What I'm working on right now is just trying to learn the basics. But I'm also working in the ESL program at the adult education program here. And I guess my main interest is language testing. So I've been having fun trying to learn more about formative assessments and how I can use that in my classroom and try to understand where my students are better. So yeah, that's me.
Great.
Yeah, and just quickly, again, my name is Brendan, first year PhD student, and something I'm working on is babysitting my cat, but also, you might hear her on the microphone, but also using data from an occupational database, ONET, to do some analyses that inform test development. And we're working on a multi-year contract to develop an adult assessment there. Great. All right. So I think we're all set to get started with some questions.
Sure.
First one we have is, in your experience working with audiences of score reporting, what challenges have you seen that might be opportunity for innovation?
Sure. And I had to just, let me say, Brendan, when you start, you said you have to babysit your cat. I closed the door because my cat has the tendency to walk through and you'd see a tail, and yeah, so the cat is on the other side of the door. So regarding your question, this, I've been working with score reporting probably since I was in grad school. It's been, 20-ish years, and started with working with Ron Hamilton. And I think this is a fantastic question. To answer it, I started thinking about what are the problems what we have to identify, almost the problems that we would look for innovations to solve. And I kind of thought of two big problems where innovations could really help with score reporting. And the first one of those is the issue of how do we connect audiences to the information that they want? And for us as segmentricians, how do we decipher and figure out what is it that audiences actually want? And we have to think about it as sometimes audiences, they just want to be informed. So there's an informational purpose for score reporting. And then sometimes, and maybe some audiences have both of these. They're also looking for actionable next steps based on data. And people like John Hattie, who's down in New Zealand, and others have really identified an important point in reporting, I think, where they've said, we need to not just articulate the purpose of the test, but also articulate the purpose of a score report. And so as report developers, I think we have to be really thoughtful about that and thinking about the differentiated audiences that we know are when we're developing reports. We have to think about these different audiences and what they're going to be doing with the report. And the report purpose can even be different based on the actual data being reported. So, the example here I have in my mind is credentialing. When the report results are good, that's typically an informational purpose. Like if you take the test to be a doctor and you get a pass, that's really all you need to know. You just need to know that you're on the upside of that pass-fail line. But if the results are not so good, You want to know, what do I do next? So that's where that actionable purpose. So now we have a report that for one set of results is just serving an informational purpose. For one set of results, it's providing an actionable purpose. So there's an opportunity for innovation here, I think. I think innovation can take a lot of different forms, but for sure, I think we need to build some flexibility into our reporting systems. Maybe that's not just technology, but also almost a conceptual innovation. I guess what I mean here is that we kind of have to move away from reporting systems that are locked into audiences as thinking of them in silos or as monoliths almost. Even within a defined audience like examinees, we can't necessarily assume that they share a common interest or common use for the data. So I think reporting systems should be centered not on necessarily, and I mean, this is where my thinking is evolving, I think. Maybe the reporting shouldn't be focused necessarily 100% on the audience, but also the desired use. So it's changing how the innovation is thinking of how we're thinking about reporting. We have components of reports that accomplish different goals, but what I'd like to see is more of a rethinking of what we're doing in reporting. And it's more than reporting, really. I mean, we're talking about, we're good at creating and reporting tests that do very narrow things, but really what our audiences are looking for is tests that actually do different things. Like they provide that informational purpose, but also those next steps. And tests that do informational things don't always do next steps very well. I mean, and that's what we've seen, all the work that Sandup and Sydney Haberman have done on subgroup reporting, or not subgroup, subscore reporting, sorry. We can do really, really great at communicating pass-fail decisions and performance level classifications, but we're not so good at the subscore stuff because our psychometrics kind of holds us back in that respect. So when we try to retrofit tests to provide different information, and we don't necessarily have a good handle on the desired use or the desired action, or we don't have the right data, our traditional approaches to reporting are kind of what we're left in. And so I think we need some innovation and some changing our thinking in that respect. So that's one way to answer this first question. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention very briefly is report contents and display. And that's where I think technology maybe more comes into play. We don't do nearly enough in psychometrics, learning from data mining, learning from cognitive psychology and how things are processed and how do we display things. And then marketing and communication is a whole nother field where their whole job is how do you present information to people so that they take it and it, you could say it's manipulative, but they're trying to evoke desired actions like go buy this thing or do this thing. So we can learn a lot if we think more interdisciplinary. Excel bar charts are not sufficient, but we don't necessarily in psychometrics bring together the right teams with the right kind of creativity to present the results in a way that accomplishes whatever goals it is that we've learned about from the audiences. I think there's some exceptions. I think formative assessment is but there's some really great work being done there. Maybe Curriculum Associates, maybe Northwest NWEA, like they have some really cool dashboards, and that's, they have the data to support what what teachers want to do with some of the work. But what I have in mind, at the state level, testing agencies, they're not thinking about the test data and results as a story to be told with actual people in mind. So there's a disconnect there. There's a few disconnects, but definitely in terms of displays, differently in terms of content, and maybe we could be doing a better job to bring in different perspectives. And then lastly, it's the innovation. We need to change also how we think about reporting in terms of who has a say in report development and the processes for bringing different perspectives into that process. We need to think about different uses, different interests, and who has access. And too often we go for low-hanging fruit with our focus groups. It's easy to bring in certain groups, and we don't necessarily reach out to parents or families who are ELs, for example. So we do really great at aiming at maybe white middle-class families, and we're not necessarily doing a great job with families that are different than that, easier to recruit, easier to talk with group. So not exactly technology, but those are some of the challenges that I see and things that I would love to see the next iteration of the standards start to address. Yeah. I think you're muted, Brendan.
Any follow-up questions from folks or comments?
Yeah, please. I can monologue, but please, I will definitely encourage if you have comments, if you have thoughts. I think Brendan, Sergio, and Gabe know that I encourage you to speak. So, but you don't have to. You can. But yeah.
Would it be okay for me to make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say that I think score reporting is not dealt with enough in the standards, and looking at some of the work that April has put out in the last few years, a lot of times I read through an article that she writes saying this should be just a whole like chapter in the standards. Like we should have April give her a little nook where she can educate us all on how to do score reporting properly. Some of the score reporting that I see is so awful. And April, you brought up a little bit ago how we have to have the people that are going to be looking at these scores in mind when we're developing them. Do you feel that sometimes the product that we deliver kind of ties the hands of the people that might be developing a score report? So, for example, if all I'm given is a normative score on an assessment, aside from showing, rank and percentile scores, is there going to be a ton of information from the assessment that can help provide good information for the parent or the teacher or the school system? Is that a thing?
Yes, it absolutely is. I mean, if I could shout it from the rooftops, and I've been in a lot of conversations. I run my own test. I'm involved in a couple new testing initiatives at UMass that we're just starting now. I consult for a couple of agencies in financial contexts, and I'm also on a couple of tax. And if I had $1 or $10 for every time I'm in a room and I'm like, but what? And we're talking about the new test, and I bring up score reporting at the very beginning of the process, and they're like, yeah, we'll get to that. No, that's wrong. I mean, it speaks to exactly what you're asking about, Gabe. It's like, if we have ideas about what we want to report, that should be at the very beginning. It's as important, in my mind, it's as important as construct articulation, as test purpose articulation, because if you don't really have the conversation about what you want to report, what the users actually want, you're not going to build a test that does those things. You're going to build a test that maybe does something close to it, but it's not going to necessarily report at the level that the users actually want. So we assemble committees for test blueprints and to define constructs. I think it's as important to have score report needs assessment sort of conversations at the early stage, not save it to the end or later on in the process. I'm not always successful, but I'm going to stand on the rooftops and keep shouting for that to happen. So
I just wanted to add a comment on that. There are increasing number of learning institutes working with learning analytics people about providing formative assessments during, like on these platforms, Canvas, Blackboard, right? Increased amount of formative information based on scores at the like K-12 or university level education. But the certified examinations are different anyways. But I was just gonna say, I think we need to communicate more with the learning analytics people to decide like what the user wants. And I really like the way you emphasize that April, because the increasing conversations about like diversity, inclusion, right? We need to know what people using these scores at the end need at the beginning to target what they want, because otherwise we're too contained in the psychometric world and we don't know what really makes the most sense to them when it comes to use the scores. So I really like that. I think that should definitely be talked more in the upcoming standards chapter for score reporting.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Let's go on to the next question. What are some caveats for using the next generation of interactive score reports?
So this is interesting because I myself am interested in what we have in mind as the next generation of reports, and I'm not even sure I know what that exactly is. So, I mean, do we as a field, what do we have, what are we thinking are the next generation reports? What makes a next generation report next generation? We're so stuck. I mean, if you think about, most credentialing tests, I mean, you just said that a moment ago, most US state tests, everything is so formulaic and it's so indistinguishable. I mean, you could just pretty much take a test from one testing program and apply it to almost any within its class. Like the state tests from the 50 US states, like if you take Massachusetts, you could almost overlay it with the test, with the score report from South Dakota or from Iowa. I mean, they're so consistent. So, there's not a ton of innovation happening in, especially those kind of standard testing contexts, I guess. So when I think about next generation reporting, I think about there's kind of two areas, right? So there's the constructs that we already measure. And so what does a next generation report look like for that? So in education, math and reading, maybe, what does a next generation report for a state summative assessment look like? I don't know what that is. We know we've already talked about how formative assessment seems to be pushing the envelope a bit and doing some really interesting things. Those reports are just oriented differently from the start. So I think they are maybe next gen in some way because they're using the data to communicate in a different way, but they're articulated differently. But then the other way, so there's the constructs that we already measure, but then there's the next generation tests. And what are those? Well, to me, those are tests that are non-traditional constructs, multidimensional constructs, when we try to report out on process rather than product. So something like the next generation science standards, right? Or, a test that's just conceptually different, like the item banks aren't created in advance, but they're generated on the fly using some kind of cloning or some kind of artificial intelligence. I'm thinking of like the smart items. We've been doing some work with Cavion in that respect over the past year or so, or what Duolingo is doing, because they're, they don't have items in the fixed way that we think of items. So in some ways, I don't think we have a great handle on how to report or what to report for non-traditional tests. And we're kind of held up again by the 20th century psychometrics. What is reliability for a multidimensional complex construct? We can do a lot of things with 20 or 30 multiple choice questions. And if it's unidimensional, all the better. But what about a multidimensional construct when you have 2 or 3 extended response, different format type questions? What can we say? So I'm kind of taking this question from interactive and next generation reports, but I'm kind of going into test development. But as I said, I think we have to be talking about the reporting on day one of test development, but it's also the use and the reporting of data on day one. Okay, so if we say that one way to define next generation reports is they're highly integrated with technology and they're interesting or different display strategies, then the caveats are this. There's got to be work done. We have to get out there and try things out, right? So if we're talking about interactive reports, anytime you want people to be doing things with data and clicking and moving and making their own interpretations, we have to get out there and try things out, right? We have to engage with minoritized populations, like harder to reach populations. I mean, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about families, if we're talking about any examinee group you can imagine. Think about there's not just one person in that group. What is their access to technology? What is their familiarity with technology? Who are they? How are they getting to the reports? What's their digital literacy? What's their assessment literacy? So, you know, I mean, interactive is awesome, but we have to know that if we're just because we put it out there, we can't assume that people are able to do things that we anticipate with it, right? I mean, that's the classic psychometrician with their feet up on the desk thing. And then if we're not doing the breadth and depth of the user group, then we're actually perpetuating barriers to using the data. So, I mean, it'd be one thing if we just put the static report out, but now we put this interactive thing, and we have these expectations that people can click and they know what to do. But it's actually not only, well, I guess it's not only perpetuating barriers, but throwing up more barriers to using the data. So I guess that's a caveat right there, is that if we think about next gen reports and we don't do the work that I'm talking about, that I'm always talking about, now we've created something that's even more inaccessible, even more inaccessible in content format and in delivery method. None of that is okay. So the standards need to be addressing interactive score reports, and again, talking to people, finding out what works, finding out what doesn't work. And I don't think that I want the next generation of standards to do a better job in that respect. That's a more positive way to spin it, right?
Permit me to make this comment.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was in another session, and we were also talking about credentialing, and an architect was there. And one of the things that he raised that struck me about the future of maybe assessment and reporting is the fact that sometimes maybe we may not be afraid to make mistakes and give access to personalized treatment of both tests and results, maybe a personalized testing and things like that. So when he said that, I kept thinking, since yesterday I've been thinking about that. But at the same time, you know, we're also afraid of the consequences of those errors. And what maybe I was thinking we may need to do is, as we push out and go all the way and not being afraid to make mistakes, we should also be cautious along the way, considering fairness and justice and all the other things associated with assessment. Try to, as much as possible, also guard against fatal consequences. That's what I just felt I should put in. So, but I, like you said, maybe some definitions has to also come. There must be some sitting down to come to define the construct of what the next generation testing and reporting will likely look like. Thank you.
I mean, I love starting off with what you started off with, which is the idea of don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to try things. And that's where I would love to see us push more, right? I mean, you don't want a more or less final product out there that's wrong, but that's where, I mean, there's a whole research and design and development process that I think we could do a lot more with, like try things out. But it's, again, making sure that we're getting a diverse participant group in there. Like, let's see what works. Let's see what doesn't. And don't be afraid to push the boundaries a little bit. But do that in the process of research and investing in the research. I mean, it's not cheap, but I think it has benefits. So thank you for that comment.
This idea of, you know, creating an assessment and not just kicking your feet up on the desk and being done kind of came up the other day when we were talking to Jen Randall. You know, the idea of like, you know, you should put resources towards finding how people are actually using the test scores and use that, like address that. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, what's done towards that end? Like, what do you have a sense of how testing company, if that's widespread, do testing companies put resources to improve the test score use? Besides just creating the test, like what's done there?
Well, I think it varies, right? I mean, some agencies do a better job. I mean, I can't say everybody. I'm just thinking of examples. Like over the past couple of years, the National Board of Medical Examiners has put a ton of work into redoing their score reports. And I know that they have, because a close colleague of mine, Frances O'Donnell, who's brilliant. She's been working on that. So Frances has been doing some fantastic work with the National Board. And in the early 2000s or so, I know there was some really cool work happening at the SAT with like, I know like Ron Hamilton and Steve Cerisi and Kristen Hoff were doing some really cool work. And that's like 15 years old at this point, but there was some really neat. And then there's like the dashboard stuff. I think there's bright spots here and there, and groups do. But as a field, I think we do much better job putting money into our standard setting, putting money into our calibration. We spend a ton of money on item development. I don't think, because all of those things tend to be kind of in-house activities. But when we talk about score reporting, you have to get out there. You have to get out into the community. You have to get out into your user groups and start thinking very critically about who those people are and how do you reach them. And it's not cheap and it's not easy. So I think it's pretty variable. I think we can learn more from each other. I know we have 50 states, and I don't expect that, 50 states in the US should have the same reports, but I think we can do a better job of learning from each other in that respect. Like there's probably more similarities in K-12 assessment than not, right? Then we have these very formulaic reports, but if we pooled resources and tried to learn, we might come out with something that's not quite so formulaic or more interesting. Same thing with credentialing. They don't necessarily always have the data, but let's learn from what National Board's doing. Let's learn from what the nurses are doing, coming out with the next gen NCLEX, for example. So there's probably going to be some really cool reports coming out of that group. In fairness, full disclosure, I'm on their TAC, so I'm going to push them to come out with some cool reports, but they're doing some really cool item formats and stuff. So small agencies, maybe not, but I would hope, where possible, can we learn from what's being done that's really interesting? Gabriel, your hands up?
Yeah, so I was thinking, April, lately, and this is just my 2 cents. Lately, I see the field of measurement where I see the most relevancy to educators on the ground is whenever we are dealing with things that are related to classroom assessment. I'm looking at, for example, what Curriculum Associates is doing with the iReady platform, where they bring in a platform that provides the teacher with this dashboard that gives them diagnostics. So when I think of one of the ways in which we can go towards next generation types of assessment, integrating large-scale assessment into a platform like iReady could allow for some formative information to be gotten from that assessment that you may not have been able to get before.
Yeah. There's some cooperation, there's some integration required there, but again, creative thinking, like opportunity, like we can go beyond this once a year, like giant event, but short, if we administer this test in 2 days in mid-April, there's only so much information you're going to get. But if we integrate within a different system and look at assessment in a different way, why not, right?
All right. Let's kick on over to the next question. This one might be quick. It might not be, but do you think all score reports should be interactive at some point?
Maybe, possibly. I guess yes. I mean, if that means that users are doing something within a report and depending on following from their desired use, that's good. I want people to interact with the data. That's a good thing. But it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So when we say all reports should be interactive, well, what does it mean to interact with a report for an individual? Can I slice and dice? Maybe the data isn't possible, so I can't really do a ton of that kind of work. Maybe I can just do limited stuff like changing reference group for comparison, very norm reference sort of stuff. It's interesting to a point, but is it informational or analysis that we're talking about by being interactive, like the NAEP Data Explorer, the International Data Explorer kind of stuff? If we have in mind a clear purpose or a clear goal of what people want to do, let's build those kind of interactive tools. But again, it's, seeing through the process, like here's the test. What do people want to do? What do they want to learn? And how does being interactive help us accomplish that goal? That's where I'm at. Like, don't just do it because we can, because it's blingy, because it's cool. Be purposeful.
Excellent. Love it. Purpose. It's great. Thank you. Which aspects of these new reporting tools should go into the new standards chapter?
Well, I think it's already been said that there's a lot that should go in. So, I mean, I could go long on this, but I tried to condense my thinking into 3 big points, right? Because there's a lot of detail. And I actually made notes on this one. I think first thing the standards need to talk a lot more about reporting and prioritize it differently and better. I think we've already said we need to articulate the purpose of the report alongside the purpose of the test and the statement of test use at the very beginning of the test development process, right there. Boom. Why are we reporting? What's the purpose of the report? Who are the intended users? What do we expect that they want? What do we know that they want? Because we've talked to them early in the process. That's number one. The second thing is we need to frame any standards on report development and engagement with regard to users. We have to address understanding and usability and accessibility reports. Do the users understand the reports? So do they, if you show somebody a document, do they get what the story is? How will users and how do they actually engage with the report given their wants? Like do they use it for the intended purpose for what we understand? And then the other part of it is the accessibility. Do the users access the reports? What are the barriers? What are the physical barriers? What are the cognitive barriers? What are the cultural barriers? Are there other barriers that I'm not even thinking of that get in the way of them accessing the reports? So right there, like thinking about the standards relative to understanding usability and accessibility. And then we need very, very explicit guidance to engage diverse participants and minoritized populations in any of our activities when we talk about getting feedbacks on reporting. Just saying, well, we need diversity. No, being very clear that when you define an audience group, thinking very broadly about who do you need to bring in, who do you need to consult in the process. There's no compromising on that for me. So yeah, I have strong feelings about these things, but yeah.
Excellent. Keeping with the standards mention that automatically generated interpretations may fail to include consideration of the context of the individuals. Is there an example of this?
See, this is a case where I think these are the 2014 standards. So I think that this standard is probably written 2012, 2013, and there's probably some kind of basic rule-based algorithm that they're referencing. which is fine, to trigger automatically generated interpretations. That's what the person who wrote this has in mind, right? And the interpretations are probably pretty static, pretty generic, not particularly creative or particularly based on data mined, like new or maybe our more technology way, the ways that we now interpret the data, right? So to me, the idea, how sophisticated your system reporting is going to have a correlation with how good or bad those generated interpretations are. And I'm thinking now, we don't just have rule-based interpretations, we could have AI-based interpretations. And I think that's where we start looking ahead a little bit, and where I think the standards actually need to be thinking about is there are good AI systems, and the systems are only going to be getting better. So now, if we're talking about AI, is what kind of privacy, what kind of risk is associated with artificial intelligence. And that's where I think these automatically generated interpretations are going to be going. So the worry for me here is actually the depth and breadth and quality of the training set relative to the actual population. But so if the AI training set is different, and it's not necessarily good or bad, but different from your actual population, then the AI is bad. Then your system, your AI system doesn't actually consider the context of the individuals, because you have an AI system that's trained on a set of people that's not your actual examinee population. So if your training set is providing feedback, doesn't include, let's say, English language learners, but English language learners comprise some portion of the examinee group, then you have a disconnect. And now that those automatically generated interpretations don't take into account the context of the individual. So you have a poor system for generating those interpretations. So again, it comes a little bit back to doing things well and building in systems that recognize your population of examinees. And you want to have all different kinds of response patterns from all different kinds of examinees in order to get a quality generation of interpretations. That's my best guess regarding the standard that's there and where I think it should go in the next version.
Awesome. We have about 15 minutes left. April, were there any questions you wanted to make sure we got to on this?
Let me take a peek here. I think the one about weaknesses in the standards, particularly relative to administration, was one. I think it's the 7th question.
Under the light of the situations that have occurred during the pandemic, is there any weakness in the standards that have become clear?
I mean, the compensation question is fascinating. And then, so, and then under standardization and universal design, because those are, we could blow up testing in some ways with some of those kind of questions, but.
Yeah, let's go with the weakness question. Are there, with the pandemic going on and maybe even with geopolitical risks now, are there any weaknesses in the standards that you see that are becoming clear given the situation?
Yeah. Yes. My answer is yes. We know more. We're thinking about testing differently, and the fact that you guys are having these conversations about the standards. I came into the field just before the 1999 standards were published, and then I had almost no awareness of the 2014 standards. So for you as the next generation of psychometricians to be thinking about this is awesome, and I'm so glad you're having these conversations. But yes, there are holes. There are some pretty significant gaps and weaknesses. So as Brendan said, I'm a psychometrician. We run a test in Massachusetts for adult ed students. So it's low stakes. The students, it doesn't actually have consequences for the students. Like they have to take it as pre-test and post-test because of a state and federal mandate. But whether they show gain or not, it doesn't matter. They're still enrolled. They still get education services, but they do have to take the test. There are consequences for the programs because programs need to show that their students are doing better. But it's not something that should be very stressful for the students. It is sometimes, but it shouldn't. It's not. They're not going to get out of services if they don't do well. The pandemic has been so hard in that context. We have spent months and months over the past, it's 2 years, helping to support programs with remote and physically distant test administration. And it's an under-resourced, under-supported population of examinees. Many of the students and these are adults, so they're between 16 and 85. There's some very older people in the population. Many of them are ELs, many of them are parents, many of them are poor, including technology poor. So there's a lot going on with this population. They want the education services, they have to be tested. And I don't necessarily like the accountability piece of it, but again, this is where, testing and policy are hitting up against each other. Coming back to the standards, there are enormous problems with standardized testing in the context of disruption. And I think, NCME did a really great series last year about the ways that disruption impacted different sectors of testing. We had to figure things out on the fly. That's all these agencies, every credentialing agency, every education agency, people like us at UMass, we just had to figure it out. The standards are great when things are usual and normal. Disruption, it was, well, what do we do? The policy mandate isn't going away. So we need, I think, to be prepared, and we need to give guidance, different guidance to agencies now that disruption has happened. Here's an example. This is not my test, but there's a test that I know of where there's a paper version and a computer version. And these are adult students. If you're taking it remotely, you type your response on a computer. And if you're in person, you handwrite it. And for adult students whose digital literacy may or may not be great, typing on a computer is very different. And it's very hard for me to believe that construct is identical. But the testing agency says, no, it's fine. And they've said that to me on the phone. So they who shall remain nameless, like, no, there's no difference. It's fine. It's not. It truly isn't. This is not anecdotal. This is like, there are score differences here. And they said, oh yeah, the score goes up in the post-test because they get used to typing on the computer. Oh my God, that's not comparable. Like, this is not okay. So dealing with disruption, dealing with comparability, dealing with standardization, that's where I think the standards really, we need to take what we've learned over the pandemic, over this time, and think about how do we create standards that address non-standard or like situations. How do we help agencies figure out what to do? And because it's been a patchwork. And do I think that we've always made this psychometrically right decision? Not necessarily. And I'll speak for myself, but we did what we had to do sometimes because of reality. People are out taking a test under a tent on a playground because it's safer. You do what you have to do because the policy isn't going away, but we still need to test. So I would like to see standards that really just help people who are actually managing and doing testing, not just behind the scenes developing the test, because some of that can be, aside from issues with pilot testing and worrying about the comparability of your data and getting good estimates. How do we help people who are actually managing and doing testing ensure that we're doing quality work under evolving and challenging circumstances? And then the other thing is, the other area, I want the standards to focus on user experience with computer-based testing. I think in some ways, I look at, I've got my standards here. You can't really see, it's all black. You can't even see it there. I think the standards look at testing in some ways as still paper-based 1980s SATs on Saturday mornings, that kind of thing. And we really need to talk about digital literacy. We need to talk about different contexts and population and what's expected or assumed by test developers. What do we need to understand by doing user experience studies with different subpopulations? We can do so many cool things and so many interesting things on a computer and administer tests. And it's some of it's okay because the upcoming generation, the kids, are going to be more savvy with computers than any generation previous. But we can add widgets, we can add color, we can add stuff to a screen, but that doesn't mean that we should. And it kind of ties in with some of the universal design stuff, but we have user interface. We can add all kinds of accessibility tools, but there's assumptions there. We assume that the users benefit from them. We assume that they know how to use them. They're going to set up their environment to their liking or what they need really quickly, and we assume that they're just going to get to business and take the test. And I don't know. That feels like a big assumption. There's potential for crowded screens. Maybe the tool doesn't make sense to some user. There's it could be distracting. We want to give examinees choice, but I think we need to be aware of the pros and also the consequences of that user experience. And it would be really, really great for the standards to address that and ensure that people are actually out there doing the work, the user experience, the user interface, even tech-savvy kids, even tech-savvy, credentialing candidates. Are we creating interfaces that work for all the diverse populations? So those two things, I think, are the holes in the standards, is like dealing with disruption and dealing with not even next generation tests, just computerized tests in general.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question. We have all 5 minutes, but let's go with understandardization. What new challenges bring the idea of understandardization and the further use of universal design in test administration? What should be the new minimum or standard if a practitioner wants to follow that path?
Okay, so under standardization, right, is we are, this is Steve Cerisi's work, right? We have to ensure sufficient flexibility in standardized testing conditions to yield the most accurate measurement of proficiency for each examinee. So that was Steve's paper. It was in EMIP last year. I think it's kind of based on his presidential address. And then UDL, or University of Science, UD, not UDL, but UD. Every student or every person, examinee, who's going to be included in the target population has to have their needs and perspectives at the center of decision making. In test development, you have to create accessible tests that eliminate the cognitive, sensory, emotional, physical barriers. And that's coming from NCEO, Martha Thurlow, and the people who do the best, most amazing work in that area. So what do those challenges bring? Or I'm sorry, what challenges do those approaches bring? Sorry, let me get my mind right. And to me, what the challenges that they bring, that's challenging the rigidity of our systems and procedures. Like, holy moly, like it's changing everything about how so many psychometricians were trained, right? Like, we're trained on processes and steps and procedures. And these approaches are asking us to put examinees first, to put the examinees at the middle or at the center of all the decisions we make. And our systems aren't really built for that, I think. It's all about sameness. It's been drilled into us. We can only make inferences if we use the same ruler for everybody. And if we're talking about centering examinees, we need to think about where they are, who they are, and build systems and tests that aren't designed as barriers. So everything that we've learned is so informed so heavily by the past. And I'm shaped by how I was taught. But I think we have to be open to new ways of thinking and this idea of centering around students. Maybe the way in is in certain testing contexts, like low stakes testing. Maybe it's formative assessment far sooner than high stakes, which I guess I associate with credentialing, admissions, and graduation requirement tests. I mean, so, if we have to start somewhere. I'm not saying that that's okay, but we have to start somewhere maybe. I don't know if I know what the answer is. I guess the part of this is, what should be the new minimum or standard if a practitioner wants to follow that path? I think for some practitioners, you're going to bump up against policy-based barriers a lot. The fundamental issue maybe is that there's very traditional or rigid ideas about what scores mean and how we attain those scores. We've been so drilled that standardization and standardizing administration, we're going to level the playing field. And maybe that's not the case. I don't think it's the case, right? So it really reinforces and institutionalized barriers, and it excludes so many people who are in our examinee populations. So I guess the way forward for me is, thinking about, can we get in some testing context sooner than others? And then the other thing is research. We need to get evidence. We need to do more research, doing the work to show that being fair, being open, changing how we do things doesn't necessarily negatively impact, whatever that means, or score interpretation isn't violated by serious work around administration flexibility if we open up our procedures and policies and do things in a universally designed way, if we design our procedures around students. So testing when we have real world consequences shouldn't be in some kind of fantasy land where standardization, we hold to this standardization, but it's actually only advantaging certain people. I think that's wrong. So that's where I get a little radical, but I love that people like NCEO, people like Steve, people like Jennifer Randall, like Maria Oliveri are pushing us to think differently and change our procedures. And that, again, is where I would love to see the standards start to open up a little bit and give some flexibility. I don't necessarily have the answer for what that looks like, but I think the conversations like this, having this with you, the next generation of psychometricians, is where we can maybe impact what comes out in the standards, and then looking ahead to the next version. Maybe when you guys are not just early career scholars, but mid-career scholars, what can we, it's probably going to look a little bit different then too. So, and then by then I'll be an old lady, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. We're running right up to time, but I'll give people a chance to say any final comments or questions before we wrap up. But if no one has anything, that's okay.
This was really mind-opening, this whole conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Zielinski. It was great.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and everything you've shared. Thank you.
Definitely. You're welcome.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time. It was really, really helpful.
Awesome.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, April. I want to echo what everyone else said. Very awesome to have you here and talk to us. And with that, we're going to wrap up. So everyone can have a great weekend, and Sergio and I will work out the recording here.
Terrific. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Brendan, for hosting too.
No problem. Good learning experience for sure.